Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we're doing a week of Valentine's recommendations. And this is a viewer request for the 1984 film Romancing the Stone. Here is your trivia question for today. What is the name of Joan Wilder's cat? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So, at the beginning of our film, we meet our main character, Joan Wilder, who happens to be a romance novelist, and she lives a pretty mundane life in New York City. At least that is until her sister reaches out to her. You see, her sister Elaine is currently in Colombia and has run into quite a bit of an issue, as two criminal cousins, Ira and Ralph, have decided to kidnap her and hold her for ransom until they get what they want. And what they want just so happens to be a treasure map that Elaine mailed to her sister Joan. So now Joan has to go from the busy streets of New York City to the wild jungles of Colombia to save her sister. Also, to make matters worse, it's not just Ira and Ralph that Joan has to deal with. There's also quite the evil villain, Zolo, who is also hot on her trail and knows about the map as well. Luckily for Joan, she does end up running into one ally, who happens to be an exotic bird smuggler named Jack Colton. Jack seems like a pretty handy guy to have around, and may be able to protect her from most of the people coming after her. But can he also save her from all of the dangers of the jungle? Mudslides, crocodiles, poisonous snakes, waterfalls, and other criminals. And of course, the most important question, will anyone actually end up using the treasure map to find the stone? This movie was directed by Robert Zemeckis. Now, unfortunately, Zemeckis had had a few bad movies kind of leading up to this one, and when the studio saw the test footage for this movie, they thought it was going to be a flop. So they actually ended up taking him off as being director of his next movie, which was going to be Cocoon. Although the studio ended up being wrong, as this movie actually did very well, and well enough that Zemeckis got to do his next film, Back to the Future. So apparently quite a few people thought Romancing the Stone was actually a bit of a ripoff of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What's interesting is the script for Romancing the Stone was actually created before Raiders. Diane Thomas was actually the writer for the original script. Now, unfortunately, she passed away in a car accident not too long after this film came out. She did not write the sequel. In fact, she was working on a film for Steven Spielberg when she passed away, but that never ended up happening. Mary Ellen Trainor plays Elaine, who happens to be Joan's sister in the film. She also worked as one of the writers for this movie, and this was actually her feature film debut. In my opinion, Kathleen Turner was a perfect Joan Wilder, but there were other actresses up for the role, including Deborah Winger, Jessica Lange, Leslie Ann Warren, and even Susan Sarandon. Apparently, Winger was actually first offered the role, but when she met with Michael Douglas, she actually apparently bit Douglas during that meeting. Originally, Michael Douglas was just the producer on the film, but eventually would take on the role of Jack Colton, and in my opinion was another perfect casting choice. This was also his first time doing an action film. Other actors that were also up for the role of Jack Colton were Clint Eastwood, Jack Nicholson, Christopher Reeve, Sylvester Stallone, Paul Newman, and Burt Reynolds. Also, another great casting choice was Danny DeVito as Ralph. However, though, that character was originally offered to Bob Hoskins, who turned that role down. Manuel Ojeda plays Zolo in the film, and in my opinion, he does a really good job of it because I hate him so much. And in my opinion, when you really dislike a villain, you know that they're doing a good job. He actually ended up getting the role due to his performance in another film called Green Ice. James Horner was originally set to score the film, but they ended up going with Alan Silvestri, and apparently that was a good enough working relationship, as going forward, Silvestri has scored pretty much every single Zemeckis film since. So did you happen to know that during the well-known dance scene, Douglas actually had no idea that the cameras were recording? He just randomly started to dance with Kathleen Turner and some of the extras, and Zemeckis decided to record the whole sequence. Also, did you happen to notice that the ship at the end of the film is named the Angelina, which is actually the same name that Joan is using for her character that we see the opening sequence for? Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg have been friends for a very long time, so much so that Zemeckis actually made a small nod to Spielberg in this film, as at one point you can see a ship that says Orca on it, which is, of course, a nod to the same ship called the Orca from Spielberg's movie Jaws. So the movie takes place in Colombia, but was actually filmed in Mexico. This is mainly due to the fact that during that time, just like how it is in the film, a lot of Americans were actually being kidnapped in Colombia. So in the early 2000s, there was actually talk of doing a remake of this film where the character of Jack Colton would either be played by either Taylor Kitsch or Gerard Butler, and Joan Wilder would be played by Katherine Heigl. So when it comes to the film Romancing the Stone, I really like this movie. I remember watching it a whole bunch of times in my childhood, and I kind of put it right up there with some of the Indiana Jones movies as well. So I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 5. Now, if you can't get enough of this film, there is actually a sequel called The Jewel of the Nile, and if you're looking for other movies that feel similar to this one, other ones I recommend are The Lost City, which in my opinion is almost like a spiritual successor, any of the Crocodile Dundee movies, any of the Indiana Jones movies, and any of the Alan Quartermain movies. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what is the name of Joan Wilder's cat? So, because Joan is a hopeless romantic, she has named her cat Romeo. Now, what's interesting is in the original script, there wasn't actually a cat. In fact, they decided to add it in as they felt that the character of Joan was almost a little too sad to not have some companionship in her life. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.